On the 23rd of September, 1941, a 35-year-old American woman stepped off a train in Lyon, France, carrying forged identity papers, a wooden prosthetic leg named Cuthbert, and absolutely zero formal intelligence training. Virginia Hall had been rejected by the United States State Department's Foreign Service because administrators deemed her disability incompatible with field work. But British intelligence saw something different when she volunteered in London months earlier. They saw someone the Germans would never suspect, someone whose limp could be explained away as a farming accident or childhood illness, someone angry enough at bureaucratic rejection to risk everything. The Special Operations Executive gave her 3 weeks of crash training in codes, weapons handling, and sabotage techniques before sending her into occupied France with instructions to organize resistance networks across the southern zone. Nobody imagined she would become the Gestapo's most wanted Allied agent. The mathematics of her situation were not complicated by the autumn of 1941, when Hall established herself in Lyon under the cover identity of a New York Post journalist named Brigitte Lecontre. The Vichy government controlled southern France through collaboration with Berlin. Gestapo officers operated openly in major cities, and French citizens faced execution for sheltering Allied operatives or downed airmen. Hall's prosthetic leg required constant maintenance because the leather straps chafed her stump during long walks through the city. The wooden socket cracked in cold weather, and the entire apparatus weighed nearly 8 pounds. She walked with a pronounced limp that drew attention on crowded streets, made running impossible, and turned every staircase into a tactical challenge. The Gestapo's Lyon headquarters stood 6 blocks from her apartment. German soldiers patrolled the railway station she used for courier meetings. Vichy police conducted random identity checks at cafes where she recruited resistance fighters. Hall had lost her left leg below the knee in a hunting accident in Turkey 8 years earlier when she was 27 and working at the American Embassy in Warsaw. A tragedy that ended her diplomatic ambitions, but somehow prepared her for clandestine work that required improvisation and pain tolerance. The amputation happened after a 12-gauge shotgun discharged while she climbed a fence, the pellets tearing through her boot and shattering bone, gangrene setting in during the 3-day journey to a hospital in Istanbul, surgeons removing the infected limb to save her life. She learned to walk again with Cuthbert during 6 months of rehabilitation, returned to clerical work at embassies across Europe, watched Hitler's armies invade Poland in September 1939, and drove ambulances in France during the 1940 German Blitzkrieg before evacuating to London. The British Special Operations Executive recruited her in March 1941 specifically because American citizenship gave her cover to operate in Vichy France before the United States entered the war, and her disability made her appear harmless to occupation authorities who could not imagine a one-legged woman coordinating guerrilla operations. Hall's first operational success came in October 1941 when she established a safe house network spanning 12 cities across southern France, each location staffed by trusted resistance members who sheltered Allied agents, downed airmen, and escaped prisoners of war. She recruited carefully through introductions from verified contacts, meeting potential operatives in churches, bookshops, and markets where casual conversation could mask reconnaissance, evaluating their commitment through small tasks before revealing her true mission. The network included a Lyon prostitute who gathered intelligence from German officers, a Vichy police inspector who provided blank identity documents, a farmer outside Perpignan who hid evading airmen in his barn, a priest in Toulouse who operated a safe house in his rectory, and a physician in Marseille who treated wounded resistance fighters without reporting gunshot wounds to authorities. Hall coordinated these disparate cells through coded messages in personal advertisements placed in collaborationist newspapers using phrases like "Aunt Marie sends her regards" to signal successful infiltrations or "Uncle Jean's health declining" to warn of Gestapo raids. Between November 1941 and August 1942, Hall organized the escape of more than 100 Allied soldiers and airmen through routes that terminated in neutral Spain, coordinating a pipeline that moved evaders from northern France through Vichy territory to Pyrenees mountain crossings. She arranged forged papers for each escapee, bribing Vichy officials for blank documents and recruiting skilled forgers who could replicate German stamps and signatures. The routes required extensive planning because German checkpoints controlled major roads, Vichy militia patrolled railway stations, and informants collected bounties for reporting suspicious travelers. Hall memorized timetables for every train route in southern France. Identified conductors willing to ignore passengers without tickets, and established protocols where guides would accompany small groups of evaders on multi-day journeys toward the Spanish border. Each successful escape required safe houses at intervals of 20 to 30 kilometers because evaders could not travel continuously without rest. Guides needed locations to hand off their charges to fresh escorts, and the entire operation depended on compartmentalization, where no single operative knew the complete route. Her reputation grew among Allied intelligence circles during spring 1942 as reports reached London describing the American woman with a limp who was running the most effective escape network in southern France. SOE headquarters began routing high-priority evaders through Hall's pipeline, including downed bomber crews whose technical knowledge made them valuable targets for Gestapo interrogators and resistance leaders whose capture would compromise entire networks. She personally escorted several high-value escapees through the initial stages of their journeys, using her journalist cover to explain why an American woman might be traveling with British or French companions through regions where foreign civilians attracted immediate suspicion. Her sabotage coordination began in February 1942 when London tasked her with supporting resistance attacks against infrastructure targets that would slow German military logistics, and she responded by training demolition teams who destroyed railway tracks, communication lines, and supply depots across the region. Hall received explosives through parachute drops coordinated with Royal Air Force bomber crews who flew supply missions over southern France on moonless nights, the packages containing plastic explosives, timing pencils, detonators, and weapons wrapped in waterproof containers that landed in fields marked by resistance members with flashlights. She taught recruits how to calculate charge placement for maximum damage to railway bridges, explaining that explosives positioned at support joints would collapse entire spans, while charges placed randomly might only crater the roadbed. The teams struck methodically through spring and summer of 1942, cutting telephone cables that connected German headquarters in Lyon to units in Toulouse, planting charges on rail lines that derailed freight trains carrying ammunition to the Atlantic coast, and burning supply warehouses that stored winter uniforms destined for the Eastern Front. If you want to see how Virginia Hall escaped the Gestapo's most intensive manhunt of the war, hit that like button and subscribe, because it helps us share these forgotten stories of courage that changed history. Back to the Virginia Hall. Klaus Barbie arrived in Lyon during November 1942 as the new Gestapo commander with specific orders to dismantle Allied intelligence networks operating in southern France, and he identified Virginia Hall as his primary target within weeks of reviewing surveillance reports compiled by his predecessor. Barbie's reputation preceded him because subordinates called him the Butcher of Lyon for interrogation methods that included electric shocks, water torture, and executions of uncooperative prisoners, techniques he employed without hesitation against French civilians suspected of resistance activity. He established an informant network that paid bounties for information about Allied agents, offering 10,000 francs for tips leading to arrests and guaranteeing anonymity to collaborators who feared resistance retaliation. Gestapo surveillance teams photographed everyone entering and leaving buildings where Hall conducted meetings, tapped telephone lines connected to her, known associates, and intercepted letters sent to addresses linked to escape network operations. Barbie personally reviewed intelligence reports each morning in his headquarters office at the hotel terminus, mapping resistance cells on a large wall chart and identifying patterns in courier movements that might reveal Hall's location. The wanted posters appeared throughout Lyon in early November 1942, printed descriptions circulating among Gestapo officers and Vichy police that identified Hall by her limp and offered rewards for information leading to her capture. The Gestapo knew her real name by that point, because a captured resistance member had broken under interrogation and revealed details about the American woman who coordinated safe houses and escape routes, though the informant could not provide her current address or alias. Barbie's intelligence officers distributed her description to checkpoints at railway stations, ordered Vichy police to investigate any foreign women matching her appearance, and placed surveillance on addresses associated with her previous operations. Hall learned about the intensified hunt through her network contacts, who worked inside Vichy police headquarters, warnings arriving through coded messages that indicated Gestapo teams were systematically raiding safe houses across the city. She abandoned her apartment on the Rue de l'Hôtel de Ville, moved to a farmhouse outside the city, changed her cover identity from journalist to agricultural worker, and altered her daily patterns to avoid locations where German surveillance teams might be waiting. Hall's evasion tactics exploited weaknesses in German counterintelligence procedures because occupation authorities struggled to coordinate between competing agencies that included the Gestapo, Abwehr military intelligence, and Vichy French police. She adopted disguises that emphasized her disability rather than concealing it, dressing as an elderly peasant woman whose pronounced limp appeared consistent with arthritis or old injuries common among rural laborers. The disguise included dark clothing worn by widows in mourning, a headscarf that obscured her hair color, and a cane that explained her slow movement through streets without raising suspicion. She varied her routes when meeting contacts, never using the same cafe twice in consecutive weeks, arriving early to observe surveillance before entering meeting locations, and maintaining cover stories that explained her presence in different neighborhoods. The Gestapo conducted random sweeps of Lyon's arrondissements throughout November, checking papers of anyone matching Hall's approximate age and build, but occupation authorities could not dedicate unlimited resources to hunting a single agent when resistance activities escalated across southern France following the Allied invasion of North Africa. Barbie grew increasingly frustrated as Hall continued evading his dragnet through November, his reports to Berlin admitting that the one-legged woman remained at large despite intensive efforts to locate her. The Gestapo commander ordered increased surveillance of known resistance sympathizers, arrested dozens of suspected collaborators for interrogation, and personally supervised torture sessions designed to extract information about Hall's whereabouts. Several resistance members died under interrogation rather than reveal what they knew about her operations, their sacrifice buying Hall precious time to evacuate Lyon before the net closed completely. Virginia Hall received evacuation orders from London on November 10, 1942, transmitted through a coded BBC radio message that instructed her to leave France immediately because Gestapo surveillance had compromised too many network contacts to guarantee her safety. The timing was catastrophic for resistance operations because German forces had just occupied Vichy France in response to Allied landings in Morocco and Algeria. Wehrmacht troops now controlled the entire country, and the demarcation line that previously separated occupied and unoccupied zones no longer provided any buffer for covert activities. Hall destroyed her codes and identity papers, buried her radio transmitter in a lion park, and traveled by train to Perpignan near the Spanish border, where resistance guides prepared to lead her across the Pyrenees through mountain passes that rose above 8,000 feet. The route crossed terrain considered difficult for experienced hikers with proper equipment, but Hall would attempt it in November weather with a prosthetic leg, inadequate winter clothing, and Gestapo teams monitoring every official border crossing between France and Spain. The group departed from a farmhouse outside Perpignan on the morning of November 15th, consisting of Hall, 3 resistance guides, and 4 other evaders, including 2 downed Royal Air Force pilots and 2 escaped French prisoners who had volunteered for the crossing. The guides explained that the journey would require 3 to 4 days, depending on weather and the group's physical condition, covering approximately 50 miles through mountain terrain where trails disappeared under snow, temperatures dropped below freezing at night, and German border patrols operated sporadically near the frontier. Hall carried a small rucksack containing a change of clothes, dried food, a canteen of water, and tools to maintain Cuthbert if the straps broke or the wooden socket cracked during the climb. The first day's march covered relatively flat terrain through forests south of Perpignan, but pain developed in her stump after 6 hours of continuous walking because the prosthetic's leather straps abraded skin that had not recovered from previous wear, and the cold weather made the wooden socket contract unevenly against her residual limb. The mountains began on the second day, when the group climbed above the tree line and entered snow-covered passes where wind gusts exceeded 40 miles per hour. Visibility dropped to less than 100 yards during snow squalls, and altitude amplified the physical toll of carrying equipment uphill. Hall's prosthetic leg created unique challenges on steep inclines because Cuthbert provided no ankle flexibility, forcing her to swing her entire leg forward with each step, rather than rolling through a natural gait, the repetitive motion exhausting her hip muscles within hours. She fell repeatedly on icy sections where the wooden foot found no purchase on frozen rocks, the impacts bruising her stump and loosening the leather straps that held the prosthetic in place, requiring frequent stops to readjust the apparatus, while the group waited in temperatures that hovered near 20 degrees Fahrenheit. The guides offered to assist her by supporting her weight, but Hall refused because any injury to the guides would doom the entire group's chances of reaching Spain, and she insisted on maintaining pace, even as blisters developed on her stump and fatigue turned each step into deliberate effort. The crossing required 52 hours of continuous movement through mountains, where rest stops were limited to brief halts that prevented hypothermia but did not allow proper recovery. And Hall later transmitted a message to London stating that Cuthbert had been troublesome, the only complaint she filed about an ordeal that left her unable to walk normally for 3 weeks after reaching Barcelona. The group descended into Spain on November 17th after crossing the final ridge that marked the international border, stumbling into a Spanish customs post where guards detained them briefly before releasing them to Allied consular officials. Hall spent 2 days recovering in Barcelona before taking a train to Madrid, meeting with American embassy staff who arranged her transportation to London via Lisbon, and reporting to Special Operations Executive Headquarters in early December. The organization debriefed her extensively about Gestapo countermeasures in Lyon, documented her intelligence about resistance networks still operating across France, and proposed awarding her a commendation for successful evasion. But Hall declined recognition because she intended to return to France, and publicity might compromise future operations. Hall transferred to the American Office of Strategic Services in March 1943 after the United States Intelligence Service requested experienced operatives with proven fieldwork records in occupied Europe, and she spent 8 months training in wireless telegraphy, weapons, and advanced tradecraft at facilities in Scotland and England. The OSS planned to infiltrate her back into France ahead of the anticipated Allied invasion of Normandy, tasking her with organizing resistance groups in Brittany that would conduct sabotage operations against German reinforcement routes when the landings began. Her previous notoriety with the Gestapo required creating an entirely new cover identity with physical disguises sophisticated enough to survive document checks and face-to-face encounters with German occupation personnel who might remember descriptions of the one-legged American spy. Hall adopted the persona of an elderly French peasant woman named Marcelle Montaigne, using theatrical makeup to age her appearance by 20 years, dyeing her hair gray, wearing thick rural clothing that added apparent weight to her frame, and practicing a shuffling gait that made her limp appear consistent with advanced arthritis rather than amputation. OSS instructors taught her advanced wireless operation techniques, including rapid encoding and transmission methods that reduced time on air when German radio detection trucks prowled rural areas, searching for unauthorized broadcasts. She learned to assemble and disassemble her radio equipment in darkness, memorized new codes that London would use for communication once she returned to France, and practiced emergency protocols for situations where Gestapo teams might close in on her transmission location. The training emphasized survival skills that her previous SOE preparation had covered only briefly, including living off the land, treating combat wounds without medical supplies, and escaping from capture situations. Hall spent weeks memorizing details of her new cover story, including fictional relatives in Alsace, a deceased husband who had worked as a railway clerk, and plausible explanations for why an elderly widow would relocate to rural Brittany during wartime. OSS staff fabricated complete documentation supporting her legend, including ration cards, identity papers, letters from fictional family members, and even photographs showing a younger Marcelle Montaigne that forgers had created by aging Hall's actual photographs through chemical treatment and careful retouching. The attention to detail reflected lessons learned from agents whose inadequate cover stories had led to their capture and execution by German counterintelligence. The insertion happened on the night of March 21, 1944, when a Royal Navy motor torpedo boat deposited Hall on a beach in Brittany, where resistance contacts waited to guide her inland to safe houses in the Creuse department. She carried forged identity papers identifying her as a widow from Alsace who had moved to rural Brittany to live with relatives, a backstory that explained her accent because Alsatian French incorporated Germanic influences that differed from regional Breton dialects. Hall established her operational base in a farmhouse outside the village of Condalier, transmitting intelligence reports to London using a wireless radio concealed in a suitcase. The broadcasts conducted at irregular hours to avoid German radio detection trucks that cruised rural areas searching for unauthorized transmitters. Her network recruited farmers, shopkeepers, railway workers, and former French army soldiers who wanted to fight the occupation but lacked weapons, training, or coordination to conduct effective operations against Wehrmacht units stationed throughout the region. Hall's primary mission focused on preparing resistance groups for coordinated sabotage that would isolate German forces in Brittany when Allied armies landed in Normandy, operations requiring weapons drops, target reconnaissance, and tactical planning that had to remain hidden from German counterintelligence. She coordinated parachute deliveries that brought in containers loaded with Sten submachine guns, plastic explosives, ammunition, grenades, and medical supplies. The drops occurring on moonlit nights when RAF bombers flew low over designated fields and released cargo that resistance teams retrieved before dawn. Hall trained demolition teams using the same techniques she had taught in Lyon 2 years earlier, explaining charge placement calculations for destroying railway bridges and demonstrating how timing pencils allowed saboteurs to plant explosives and evacuate before detonation. The groups conducted reconnaissance missions that identified German fuel depots, ammunition storage facilities, communication centers, and troop concentrations, forwarding the intelligence to London through Hall's wireless transmissions. She personally participated in several operations despite orders from OSS headquarters to avoid direct action, planting explosives on railway tracks north of Montluçon that derailed a German supply train carrying artillery shells and leading a team that cut telephone lines connecting Wehrmacht headquarters in Vichy to field units in coastal Brittany. Her network expanded rapidly through spring 1944 as word spread that an effective organizer was operating in the Creuse region, local resistance groups requesting weapons and training that Hall provided through careful vetting and gradual integration into her command structure. She maintained strict operational security by limiting face-to-face meetings, using cutouts to communicate with cells in different villages, and constantly changing her transmission locations to avoid German radio detection efforts. German counterintelligence never identified Hall as the coordinator behind increased resistance activity in Brittany, her elderly peasant woman disguise providing cover that survived occasional German checkpoints where soldiers waved her through without serious inspection. The resistance networks Virginia Hall organized in Brittany destroyed 4 railway bridges, derailed 7 German supply trains, cut communication lines in 37 locations, and killed or wounded an estimated 150 Wehrmacht soldiers during the 2 months preceding the Normandy invasion on June 6, 1944. The sabotage operations forced German commanders to divert troops from coastal defenses to protect supply routes, delayed reinforcement movements toward invasion beaches by an estimated 12 to 18 hours during the critical first days of the campaign, and demonstrated that coordinated resistance could impose significant costs on occupation forces when properly equipped and led. Hall's intelligence reports about German unit positions, defensive preparations, and logistics routes reached Allied commanders through OSS channels, contributing to targeting decisions for aerial bombardment and helping invasion planners understand Wehrmacht capabilities in the Brittany sector. She remained in France until September 1944, when Allied armies liberated the regions where she operated, then returned to London for debriefing before deploying to Austria in early 1945 to organize anti-Nazi resistance networks during the war's final months. Her Austrian mission focused on intelligence gathering rather than active sabotage because German forces were collapsing rapidly under combined Allied pressure from east and west, the Reich's final weeks offering opportunities to collect information about Nazi officials attempting to escape prosecution and weapons caches that might fuel post-war resistance movements. Hall operated in Austria until May 1945, when Germany surrendered unconditionally, her wartime service spanning 4 years from her initial arrival in Lyon through the final operations in the Alpine regions, where Nazi leadership made last futile stands. The United States awarded Hall the Distinguished Service Cross in September 1945, making her the only civilian woman to receive the decoration during World War II, though she requested the ceremony be conducted privately in an office rather than a public event because she intended to continue intelligence work. President Harry Truman presented the medal personally, reading a citation that praised her courage and effectiveness while operating behind enemy lines despite physical disability that would have disqualified most candidates from field work. The British government appointed her a member of the Order of the British Empire for her Special Operations Executive Service, recognizing operations in Lyon that had kept escape networks functioning during the period when Gestapo counterintelligence was most effective. Hall joined the Central Intelligence Agency when it formed in 1947, working as an intelligence analyst until her retirement in 1966 at age 60, but she never discussed her wartime service publicly and declined interview requests from historians researching OSS operations. The Gestapo's failure to capture Virginia Hall represented more than the escape of a single agent, because her survival meant resistance networks continued operating throughout periods when German counterintelligence believed they had suppressed Allied intelligence activities in France. Klaus Barbie never stopped searching for the one-legged American spy, maintaining her file as an active case until he evacuated Lyon ahead of Allied liberation forces in August 1944. And he faced trial decades later for war crimes that included torture and execution of resistance members who refused to provide information about her network. Hall's operations demonstrated that effective intelligence work depended less on physical capability than on operational security, recruitment skills, and willingness to accept risks that conventional military planning would reject as unacceptable. The wooden leg that ended her diplomatic career became irrelevant in clandestine operations, where success required courage, adaptability, and commitment rather than physical perfection. And the bureaucrats who rejected her State Department application in 1931 could never have imagined that the disability they considered disqualifying would one day make her invisible to enemies hunting Allied agents across occupied Europe. Her story remained largely unknown for decades after the war because intelligence services maintained operational security around agent identities and methods, Hall herself refusing to discuss her service even with family members who knew only that she had worked for the government during wartime. Historians began documenting her achievements in the 1980s and 90s as classified records became available through declassification reviews, the emerging details revealing that one of the war's most effective intelligence operatives had been a one-legged woman whom the State Department had rejected as unsuitable for diplomatic service. The Central Intelligence Agency headquarters in Langley, Virginia, now honors Hall through exhibits describing her wartime operations and photographs showing her at various stages of her career, from Lyon through her CIA retirement. French communities where she operated have erected plaques commemorating her resistance work. Local historians documenting how the American woman with the limp organized networks that helped dozens escape Nazi persecution and conducted sabotage operations that slowed German military movements during critical periods. Hall died on July 8, 1982, in Rockville, Maryland, at age 76, her obituaries finally revealing to the public the extraordinary story of wartime service that she had kept secret for nearly 4 decades. If you found Virginia Hall's story as remarkable as we did, subscribe to keep these memories alive, and let us know if anyone in your family served during World War II, because their stories matter just as much as the ones we tell here. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.